This episode is brought to you by La Quinta by Wyndham. Your work can take you all over the place, like Texas. You've never been, but it's going to be great because you're staying at La Quinta by Wyndham. Their free Bright Side breakfast will give you energy for the day ahead. And after, you can unwind using their free high-speed Wi-Fi. Tonight, La Quinta. Tomorrow, you shine. Book your stay today at lq.com.
Today on CityCast Madison. What makes a building in Madison historic and worthy of saving? How do you preserve the past without ignoring our city's current challenges? That debate is happening right now for a proposed development on State Street and was an issue earlier this year for buildings on the Mifflin Street Arcade. It's the job of Madison's Landmarks Commission to recommend which buildings and even whole neighborhoods are historic, and once designated, the Landmarks Commission must approve any changes to those historic sites. To explain how it all works, today, Bianca Martin talks to Madison historian and former chair of the city's Landmarks Commission, Stu Levitan. It's Wednesday, April 10th. I'm Dylan Brogan, and here's what Madison's talking about.
Stu, hey, how are you?
I'm great, Bianca. Good to see you.
Likewise. It's wonderful to see you. You are one of the keepers of our stories here in Madison.
Well, I try. I think it's important. That's why I was pleased to serve on the Landmarks Commission for so many years and why I like writing these history books, because I think history is important.
Yes.
If you don't know where you've been, you won't know where you're going.
It's true. And you know what? You once headed up the Madison Landmarks Commission, among many other leadership positions that you've held in our city.
I was chair for about half of my 12 years on the commission, and it was a great honor, and I thought we did some good work. I had some great people to work with, and it was a great experience.
Yeah. And so what does that body do?
That body creates and protects historic landmarks, landmark sites, and historic districts. There are a number of standards for which a building or a district would need to meet in order to be a historic landmark or a historic district. Would you like me to explain what those are and give you examples and how that works?
Sure, that sounds good. Yeah, kind of a brief overview of that process.
Okay, so there are 5 standards for being a historic site or a historic district, whether it is associated with a broad pattern of the cultural or the political or the economic or the social history of the location of Madison. That would be something like Machinery Row, showing how we were a center point of the agricultural implement industry, the tobacco warehouses, the Badger State shoe factory. Those are examples of landmarks that are economic or social history. Whether or not a building is associated with the life of an important person or events. The city just created a landmark site for Catherine Clarenbach's home on the west side of Madison. Catherine Clarenbach was one of the founders of the modern feminist movement. She was one of the founders of the National Organization for Women. And so her house is a landmark. Aldo Leopold's house, one of the fathers of the environmental and conservation movement. Whether or not it has important archaeological or anthropological significance. Madison is built on the ancestral home of the Ho-Chunk people, the Tejo. We are in Tejo, and there are numerous effigy mounds in the Madison area, and a half a dozen of them or more have been landmarked as sites for which Madison is now has statutory protection to honor that part of our heritage. Whether or not it embodies distinguishing characteristics of architectural types, going back to Italianate sandstone from the 1850s or the Queen Anne and Richardson Romanesque of the late 19th century, Art Deco, Art Moderne, the Prairie style, or whether or not it's representative of the work of a master builder or designer. We've got 5 Frank Lloyd Wright buildings that we've landmarked. We've got Louis Sullivan. We've got Claude and Starks. Those are the standards that a property or a district would have to meet in order to get landmark status or be created as a historic district.
And so the commission, that's the work that you all do, is making those determinations and making recommendations to the city council on what should be preserved. Does that sound fair?
Yes. Yeah. When we were created, originally the Landmark Commission actually had the power to designate landmarks in historic districts, but over time, I think appropriately that designation was given up to the Common Council because there are certain restrictions that go on with landmark designation as a district or a site. There are things you can't do without approval. You need a certificate of appropriateness for external modifications or to tear down a building. And, there's some historic ordinances, the one that regulate interior design. I know the Historic Preservation Ordinance in Galena, Illinois, regulates interior paint styles. I don't think the people of Madison would have let us do that, but we do have significant power to regulate the exterior of a property or what's built in a historic district.
Yeah, and this work is really, really of interest to so many right now because we're in this, one of the main topics our city is facing is discussing affordable housing. Yes. And that's always a topic, and it's huge right now. I do want to ask, the commission makes recommendations to the city council, so that's the structure, but the council doesn't have to take your advice. So do you guys often align? Is there a lot of back and forth?
We've generally been of the same mind. There were two very big controversies about 10, 15 years ago that showed both sides of that equation. One was when the Edgewater Hotel wanted a massive expansion, a new high-rise at the end of Wisconsin Avenue. It's in the Mansion Hill Historic District, which regulates the massing of buildings, and you're not supposed to be able to build a building that is out of conformity with the general size of buildings in the immediate area. The Edgewater Hotel is huge, and appropriately applying the ordinance, the Landmarks Commission rejected the certificate of appropriateness and said, no, you can't build it. They appealed it to the Common Council, and the Common Council, looking at the broader citywide issue of economic development, tourism, expansion, decided that it was in the city's long-term interest to override the Landmarks Commission and approve the Edgewater expansion. And I understood that from the citywide perspective. A few years later, also in Mansion Hill, a few blocks away, a developer wanted to tear down a 1960s high-rise, tear down a 1870s rooming house and move another house and build 3 large brownstones. And the Landmarks Commission, again, rejected that because the massing of those 3 buildings was too great for the neighborhood. And the developer fought us at the Common Council, and the Common Council sustained the Landmarks Commission overwhelmingly. Now, I think if that same controversy came today, the current Common Council would very likely overturn the Landmarks Commission and decide to tear down the Highlander, tear down that other 1870 building, and build the new housing. I don't know what the Landmarks Commission would do, but I think the Common Council would have a very different attitude about that sort of development than it did in 2014 when this happened.
So there's these regular tensions, ongoing tensions that are going to be happening between economic development and preserving the historic nature of...
When you said economic development, that's a very interesting way to look at it, because when the Landmarks Ordinance was created, it was part of the downtown revitalization plan, and it was seen as a means of enhancing economic development. The protection of historic resources was considered an economic positive.
I love this. This topic is so saucy. And I have to tell you, Sue, I will be walking down State Street and muttering to myself like a mad woman, foaming at the mouth, angry at some of the changes. So I'm excited that we're getting into this.
This episode is brought to you by ShipStation. If you run an e-commerce business, you know how much work it takes to produce something great while dealing with complicated shipping issues. That's why over 130,000 companies have turned to ShipStation, an innovative tool that allows you to focus less on shipping and more on building your brand. With ShipStation, you can manage orders, label printing, reporting, and customer service on one easy-to-use dashboard. You'll reduce warehouse costs with reliable enterprise solutions and save thousands on shipping costs with discounts up to 89% off. Plus, you can effortlessly import orders from everywhere you sell online. So, turn your shipping challenges into opportunities for growth. Go to ShipStation.com and use code POD to sign up for your free 60-day trial. That's ShipStation.com, code POD.
It sounded like when you were describing sort of the works of the commission that it's both like preserving singular buildings and structures, but also preserving the nature of the neighborhood. Can you talk about that?
Yes. We've got both the ability to designate individual landmark sites, and there are currently 183 landmark sites. I mean, the buildings go back to the 1840s, but the historic sites that we've preserved go back to 500 of the Common Era because we've preserved effigy mounds. But in terms of the neighborhoods, we also have the ability to create historic districts, and there are 5 historic districts, 4 of which, not surprisingly, are on the isthmus. There's the Mansion Hill Historic District, which is the golden age. This was the 1890s. This was a neighborhood that was just chock-a-block full of Supreme Court justices and state senators and governors. And this is where the original governor's mansion was.
Is this where you drive by on East Gorham?
This is Wisconsin Avenue, Gilman, Gorham. This is the Pinckney Street. This is the heart of historic Madison. The Third Lake Ridge over on Lake Monona, Spade Street, Jennifer, Williamson Street, that area. There's a historic district in University Heights which was a suburb developed in the 1890s and thereafter, and was filled with university professors and presidents and great Queen Anne architecture and so on. There's the Marquette Bungalow District, which is out near the Yarra River, which is just 4 blocks, but it's a concentration of bungalows, which are architecturally, it's a very intriguing little subdivision within the larger Madison community, and also the First Settlement District, which is again downtown, where the earliest settlers of Madison lived. So those are the 5 historic districts that we've created. I tried to get a State Street historic district in the 20 years ago, and historic districts require buy-in by a certain number of property owners, which was impossible to get. You don't need the property owner to agree to designate an individual site, but to get the historic district, you do. There would have been a lot of development discussions and debates over the last 10 or 15 years if we had created that State Street Historic District.
I'm glad that you brought that up because State Street is one of the hot button issues right now. There's multiple developments being discussed around housing. You know, we're talking about Madison's experiencing a building boom, and there are different proposals for the 100 block of State Street and the 400 block of State Street, and then 100 Mifflin, which is kind of right in that same area, in that same region. Can we get into that to kind of use that as an example of how the process works about determining what's officially historic and what's worth saving?
Sure. And actually, there are 2 great case studies in the 100 block of State Street, one of which I think had a positive ending, one of which is still in flux. On the Overture side of the west side of the 100 block of State Street, which starts with the Teddy Wedgers and goes down to across the street from the Overture. Several years ago, some of the people involved in Overture, through various means, acquired most of that block of the 100 block of State Street. And their plan was to tear most of it down, have a little park, and have a pleasant view shed for the people in Overture to look out on. And the Landmarks Commission fought that with everything we had. I mean, I even commissioned a landscape architect to make new drawings of how those properties that were there could be saved and renovated and brought into good use, because some of those buildings architecturally were very significant. So we denied the certificate of appropriateness, fought it at the Common Council. The Common Council maybe just went, and the Plan Commission supported us, and the Common Council supported us and blocked that development. The Overture people, and I'm speaking mainly about Grant Fauci and the Fauci family, they could have just walked away. They could have said, the hell with it. We had a great idea. We're going to just leave these properties to decay and good riddance. And what they did, to their credit, is they said, okay, you didn't like our plan. Let's see what we can do to improve this block. And if you go down that block of State Street, you'll see those buildings have been the building on the corner has been recreated in its legitimate architectural style. There are new economic development opportunities. The Madison Community Foundation is one of those buildings. There's wine and chocolate shops there. That block has been saved and was a perfect example of how the process works correctly.
Wow.
Developers came in with an idea. We said, nah, it's not going to work. And they stuck with it, to their credits. I think, that's a real success story.
Yeah, that's fascinating to me to hear about the idea of creating, as much as I like parks and sitting in the grass. Now we have this constant conversation about housing and needs for housing, which is now part of the discussion for the other side of the block, right?
Right. But if people ever eat at the Cento, that was one of the buildings that was going to be torn down for a little park. We said, no, this is a building that's worth saving. And they said, okay, we can do that. On the other side of State Street, there was a proposal several years ago, back when I was still chair of the commission, to build a boutique hotel. And we said, okay, yeah, we can support that. It's a good design. It's architecturally legitimate. And we gave them the certificate of appropriateness. Unfortunately, the money got tight, the financing fell through, but it wasn't regulation that stopped that project. It was capitalism.
The hand of the market.
The hand of the market and the hand of the bankers in the market. Yeah. I tell you, I was dumbstruck when the Plan Commission rejected that project down in the 400 block of State Street. I could have bet money that would just sail through. And I'm not sure what happened there, because I thought the dynamic of today's council and today's commissioners was, you're going to build housing? Okay, you can do it. In my neighborhood, they even put $1 million house on a historic site that is not going to be affordable housing. But
there is kind of an overarching question, like, how do we balance the needs of saving old buildings and buildings with historic value and our needs for housing?
We have the tools in place. We have what I think is one of the best ordinances in the country on historic preservation. We went through a complete rewrite of the ordinance maybe 6 or 7 years ago. The Landmarks Commission, I thought, did a good job. The Common Council, I think, even improved it. So we've got an ordinance in place that does that balance. It provides opportunities for input from all interested stakeholders. It has a meaningful role for the council to provide oversight for the commission, and it depends on the people who are appointed and elected to exercise those levels of power. And that's up to the voters to elect good alders and a good mayor. It's up to the mayor to appoint good commissioners who understand the role of landmarks, who understand the role and the need for affordable housing and housing in general and economic development. And it's ultimately up to the people involved, because the system is in place.
And I have to say, looking at some of the proposals and things that are happening around State Street and around the Capitol, I found it really interesting that another component is the building owners. And a lot of these buildings have been left to disarray. And so that has to be in consideration.
And one of the things in the new ordinance is we made demolition by neglect a serious offense. And we have written orders. We have prosecuted people for demolition by neglect, because one of the tricks of people who want to build something is to let what they've got run down until they come in and say, oh, it's going to cost too much to fix it. And city governments say, oh, yeah, you're right, you can tear it down. And the current ordinance has a very strong demolition by neglect provision that people have been fined. And you can't get away with that in Madison anymore.
It sounds like people who are bad at ending relationships, and they're like, I'm not going to break up with you, but I'm going to stay in the relationship and let this deteriorate, and then it'll be too far gone. But you're saying, no, we are not allowing that. We will fine people for that reason. I am curious, what are some of Madison's maybe biggest mistakes that we've ever made? Like things that we did not save, but in hindsight, we're like, yo, we definitely should have.
The first great example is was a farmhouse out University Avenue called Mapleside. It was built by Abel and Pamela Dunning in 1846. They were the first white settlers in Dane County to plant crops. And this was a massive Georgian revival farmhouse. It had, sandstone 18 inches thick. It had 30-foot beams. It even had basement tunnels that were said to be stops on the Underground Railroad. This was an important building. It was important people. It was architecturally important. And in 1969, somebody wanted to buy it to tear it down to build a Burger King. And this went on back and forth for months. And finally, there was no way the city could stop it. And on Valentine's Day, 1970, Mapleside was torn down to build a Burger King that went out of business shortly thereafter. It's 3535 University Avenue. In the aftermath of that, the mayor at the time, who was Bill Dyke, who was the most conservative mayor in the modern era of Madison. I mean, this is the guy who Paul Soglin would then beat in 1973. This was a guy who ran with Lester Maddox as his vice presidential candidate in 1976. This was an arch conservative mayor. He sponsored the Landmarks Commission ordinance because he recognized that historic preservation is an important aspect to a community's identity. So that's the great example of a building that should have been saved. The William Vilas mansion at the corner of Wisconsin and Gilman, and the Lucian Vilas Hanks home next door. Those were extraordinary homes of the 19th century that should have been saved. So those are the first two things that really jump out as, oh, we blew that one. But the Mapleside has served us in its death because it provided the impetus to create the Historic Preservation Ordinance.
Wow. Well, we only get to take a bite out of this, but I feel like we covered so much ground. And, are there any last thoughts that you have on the value and importance of considering the historic nature of our neighborhoods and our structures here in Madison as development continues?
Just to remember that experiencing the places where our forebears lived and worked helps us understand their lives and times, and it provides us with an insight into how we got here and what our lives and times are. And it is an important aspect of who we are and who we hope to be and who we hope the people who follow us will become. And I just hope people understand the importance of historic preservation and will support our efforts.
Stu, thank you so much for joining us. It was wonderful.
My pleasure, Bianca. Thanks for having me.
That was Madison historian Stu Levitan. That's all for today here on CityCast Madison. I'm Dylan Brogan. If you enjoyed the show, why not share this episode with someone who remembers the Rollerdrome? That paved paradise is now home to a coffee roaster. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Until then,